In our series, we took a look at several chapters that we kind of condensed because it had to do with the division of the land. I guess part two was one way to look at it. The earlier portion had to do with the 2.5 tribes in the Cisjordan area, the east of the river, east of the Jordan. And then for the distribution of the land for the remaining 9.5 tribes. In there, we had that beautiful little story about Caleb wanting to take off the biggest, the baddest, and the toughest. And he wasn't backing down for anything. He said, "I can get them." So all kinds of things that we rejoiced there. As we excuse me, ended last time in chapter 20, you have the cities of refuge. Okay, and the cities of refuge were what?
Places for people to flee when someone was killed.
Yes. Places for people to flee when someone was killed. Okay. Now, the death of a human being is called a homicide. Okay. Homicides fall biblically fall into two categories. What are they?
Murder and manslaughter.
Murder and manslaughter. Okay. Sorry, that's the way it works. Ask any cop; they'll tell you that, or any prosecuting attorney. It's now we have broken down, as I mentioned this last week. We have, depending upon what state you're in, state laws vary a lot on this and how they cross over first, second, even third degree murder. Same thing with manslaughter charges. Okay, and on top of that, we have voluntary manslaughter, which leaves me kind of scratching my head a little bit because biblically that is nothing more than premeditation. If you voluntarily choose to take someone's life, that fits into the murder category because it's premeditated. But depending upon what state you're in, some of these things flow from first degree manslaughter kind of willy-nilly into second or third degree murder, and it can be a little confusing. Don't get too sidetracked with that. Okay, you can research that on your own. You can go to the internet and type in the name of a particular state and look up the government laws on murder and manslaughter and so forth, and they'll clue you all in. Okay. The point here being that God had given a buffer, if you want to call it that, a safety net to guard the legal system of Israel so that there wouldn't be retaliation out of pure emotionalism when somebody died, either premeditated or accidentally. And manslaughter, biblically speaking, is just that, when somebody dies by an accident without any premeditation. Murder requires intent ahead of time to do either serious bodily injury or death or injury that results in death. Okay, different phrasing again with the legality. Okay. What it boiled down to is simple enough. Almost equidistant, okay, throughout this thing. What you had and it's kind of an interesting thing. There were 6 cities of refuge, okay, and they were kind of going like 2 here, 2 here, and 2 here, but it wasn't quite equal. It was 2 up here, and then there was 2 here, and then there was 2 shorter distance. It was because of apparently, God understood where these things needed to go because of the population density of the land. Also, ease of access. Okay? The Jewish mythology, I'll put it that way, is that all of the pathways, the roadways to a city of refuge were clearly marked. Okay, I mean, big arrows follow the yellow footprints, the yellow brick road, whatever, to see the Wizard of Oz. All of them were clearly kept open and aware, because you didn't want some type of a vendetta killing to take place when somebody actually wasn't guilty of murder. It was an accidental death, but according to the Mosaic law structure, if the surviving family members could get to the one who had caused the death before he got to a refugee city. They could kill him legally with no repercussions. Okay? So God set up a system whereby if there was a death caused, then the guy beat feet as fast as he could to get to one of these refugee cities. Okay? He got there, pleaded for entry, probably breathlessly after having run far enough and fast enough to get there. He pleaded for refugee status. They would then, contain him. Normally, there was a party that was chasing him shortly thereafter. They would then call in all the witnesses. The elders of the refugee city had this responsibility. They would call that situation in. They would examine the evidence instead of just the flaming emotion of the moment. And then they would come to a verdict over whether the guy was guilty of murder or whether he was guilty of manslaughter. If he was guilty of murder, they just threw him back out the gate and let the family go ahead and take care of it. End of story. If it was manslaughter, they would then grant him refugee status inside the city for as long as the high priest, the current high priest, remained alive. Okay. Now, that could vary from 2 days to 20 years. You just didn't know. Okay. And that kind of might seem kind of odd, but sometimes, God does things that he doesn't explain, but, it wasn't a set 6 months or 6 years of this refugee status. Okay.
Roger,
Yes.
is there any indication that this system was actually used in Israel?
Okay, it raises a very interesting point because we find no biblical record that anybody ever fled to a refugee city. Okay. Now, some people have come to the conclusion, well, it was just kind of make-believe, or it was never put into effect, or this or that. In all probability, it was put into place and utilized on a fairly regular basis, but once God had established it, he didn't feel there was any real need to record any particular incident that took place. Like it's there, they used it. It's kind of like levirate marriage, where Ruth, was dealing with the kinsman redeemer. You don't have, you got the story of Ruth, but kinsman redeemer was written into the Levitical law as well, but you don't have, but yet you would assume, hate to use that word, that it was such a normal part of life within the Jewish nation that why write about something as common as brushing your teeth, so to speak? That's probably the best answer I can give you. Excellent question, though. It really is. Okay. Now, when you get to, then the focus shifts a little bit when you get to chapter 21. Chapter 20 has to do with the cities of refuge. Okay. Chapter 21 says that the heads of the fathers then came near the heads of the fathers, the leaders of the Levites. Remember, this is the tribe. This is the we would call the 12th tribe, actually the 13th family. But again, this is the last one, and this one had the distinction of no land. Now, some have tied this in, by the way, to you would call it the blessing cursing scenario at the end of the book of Genesis, where Jacob, renamed Israel, gives blessings and cursings to his 12 sons. Okay? Turn back there for just a moment at chapter 49 of the book of Genesis, because it makes kind of an interesting thing to think about. It's kind of hard to nail something solid for a conclusion. Okay? Let me see. Somebody start with verse 5 and read chapter 49, verses 5, 6, and 7 for us.
Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, into their assembly. Mine honor be thou not united, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel.
Okay. I will scatter them in Israel. Predictive, prophetical. Okay? The old guy on his deathbed gives a prophetical thing that obviously comes from God himself and has to do with some actions of Simeon and Levi when they had done certain cruel and fierce and wrathful actions in their past. Kind of like the whole thing with Reuben, the father's bed thing, and we're not going to go there. But this, God knows this stuff, and this stuff then carries down. Some have suggested, might very well have merit, that this is at least one of the contributing factors why Levi was chosen to have these, what boils down to, we find 48 cities or 48 towns, municipalities. Some of them were larger, some of them were quite small, that became the Levitical cities. So in chapter 21, it tells you in the first 3 verses here that the heads of the tribes came together, and it said in the middle of verse 2, the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses to give us cities to dwell in, with the suburbs for our cattle. And the children of Israel gave to the Levites out of their inheritance at the commandment of the Lord the cities and their suburbs. Okay, the division. Okay? So out of the dividing of the entire land scenario, now you have 48 towns that are scattered around. If I remember right, 10 of these were east of the Jordan over here, because the majority of the population of Israel was on the west side of the Jordan. So the other 38 were over there. Out of these 48, 6 were cities of refuge. Interestingly enough, Hebron was one of them. Hebron, you remember, figured into Caleb, with the conquering of the Anakim back in chapter 14, the giants, and everything that goes with that. It's kind of fun to tie stuff together. Okay, so you go down through, and this basically, how about I'll condense a lot and summarize here. You've got lists of peoples and tribes and territories and etc. Apparently, these were primarily dispersed because of the 3 sons of Levi. The three sons of Levi. I have to watch that. I never was a math major. The 3 sons of Levi. You got the Kohathites, for instance, mentioned in verse 4 and so forth. How many cities, who got, where they were dispersed, what the towns' names were, and all of that absolutely exciting stuff. And I'd rather focus on the principles behind some of this than get too bogged down with that. Verse 13 talks about Hebron, the children of Aaron the priest. You got Hebron with her suburbs. And it was also a city of refuge for the slayer. Okay? And that goes on in the list. I just bring that up to point it out to you. As you go down through all this, that's what the whole chapter's about. So you want to do a whole bunch of research in what town went where, and which kid, family name went to who, and okay, go ahead, have fun with that. Let's drop down to verse 41 towards the end of the chapter. All the cities of the Levites within the possession of the children of Israel were 48, including the suburbs. You had to have places to raise crops. You had to have places to pasture your cows. That acreage was granted along with the township proper. Okay? These cities were every one with their suburbs round about them, as were thus all the cities. Okay, verses 41 and 2. Now, here's the thing. We understand, or we should understand, that though the phrasing may kind of, in places, may cloud the issue, that all of this was not totally under the perfect control of the nation of Israel at the time this was written, at the time these cities were divided, at the time the lands were given to the 12 tribes of Israel. There were all kinds of resistance from the Canaanite peoples that was still part of the process, okay? Everything that went with it. But somebody read Deuteronomy for us, chapter 7, if my notes are right. Deuteronomy chapter 7, and it should be verse 22.
And the Lord thy God will put out those nations before thee by little and little. Thou mayest not consume them at once, lest the beasts of the field increase upon thee.
Okay? In other words, God predicted, and this is Moses, during Moses' era, that God would go before the Jewish nation and drive out the Canaanite peoples of the land a little at a time. In other words, gradually. Okay? What you see under Joshua's military campaigns is the first major expulsion of the Canaanite peoples. But then, after the military campaigns were concluded, you had all kinds of guerrilla pocket resistance. Okay? You had local Canaanite peoples with their own little fortress cities and their militias and their mini armies that were resisting Israel. And as we found over and over and over, and that you find in the book of Judges as well, that they did not drive them out the way they were supposed to. And by the time you get to the middle of the era of the Judges, you see all kinds of problems, because it wasn't just the people's presence, it was the idolatry that was there. Okay? And that became an influence. You know. Yes, Dave?
That happened, that was a long period of time. Because in Judges, the chapter I'm looking at, it says 300 years.
It's about 300 years.
300 years, they're still trying to control the land from the time they first occupied that one section. So it's it's not happening in a couple of years.
No, this is a centuries-long scenario. Kathy?
I think that kind of interesting. I didn't know wildlife management was in effect clear because it says not to kill, don't kill them all at once, lest the beasts of the field increase upon thee, doesn't that mean that all the...
It means all the lions and the jackals, would eat all the dead bodies scattered around,
So
and then you'd have problems with all of the population explosion of the lions and the jackals. Tongue-in-cheek wildlife management. But that's pretty much is what's indicated there. Yeah, you see, if you take a 1446, 1445 date, which is pretty firm for the Exodus, and then you got 38 and a half years in the wilderness and so forth. Well, then you got Joshua getting to the land. By the time he gets there is about 1406 or 1407. It takes him about 8 years to get through the major military campaigns. So you've got like 1397 to 1398, okay? That's basically when the period of Judges begins in its initial stage. Okay? Now, the first king doesn't come on the scene until Saul. Okay, that's 1051. Okay, so you do the math, and you've got a period of 1051. No, I'm sorry, 1091. That was David. 1050. Is that right? Oh, you don't know? Okay, all right. I figured some of you year scholars out there would not. Let me see if that. No, 1051. Anyway, you've got a little over, apparently there was a little over 3 centuries of time that David, reminded us of. So this gradual trying to push these people out, and sometimes it's just easier to compromise and say, if they stay on that side of the mountain, we'll just stay over here, but that's disobedience to God. God said they were supposed to drive them out. And when they compromise, pretty soon you've got Saturday night barn dances. And somehow the Ammonites get invited because they realize that cheap beer. Okay, so here they come. Well, they start eyeballing the Israel girls, and the girls start flirting back. You know, hormones come into place. Well, before you know it, especially after like 40 or 50 years, you've got various mixed marriages, and mixed marriages in that kind of a scenario means that idolatry permeates the Jewish nation. Okay? And that over and over and over, you see that emphasis in the book of Judges. That, you know, this is the problem. Okay? It's not the economics, it's not the difference of philosophies, it's not the different skin tone, you know, or what type of, you know, it's you know, towel you wrap around your head or anything else, or how you herd the sheep or the cows. You know, the problem, God says, is idolatry. The problem is you're going to learn the ways of foreign gods, and in doing so, you're going to walk away from the pure worship of the God of Israel. Over and over you have that thing. Okay? It's somebody read Deuteronomy 33 now. Deuteronomy 33, verse 10. Let's learn something about the Levites, what they were there for. Okay? What do you think they were there for? Before whoever reads that reads it. You know, why did God make, what was the purpose of this, taking the Levite group and setting, everybody else is farming the land, everybody else is possessing, everybody else is doing everything else. So what was the purpose of the Levites?
Were they priests? Or
Not all Levites were priests. It included the Levitical priesthood, yeah.
I think they were sort of the equivalent of pastors, like a tribe of church leaders
Yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah.
Except it was not.
Yeah, that's close. That's close.
I think
That's one way to express it. Somebody go ahead there and read Deuteronomy 33, verse 10.
They shall teach Jacob thy judgments, and Israel thy law. They shall put incense before thee, and whole burnt sacrifice upon thine altar.
Okay. That's the main focus for the tribe of Levi. They were to teach the Mosaic law to Israel. Okay. Generation after generation, decade after decade, they were supposed to be teaching them the Mosaic law structure. You know, they were to hold them accountable to the uncompromising nature of the do's and don'ts of the law system. Okay. That was so. You know, they were to be doing the preaching and the teaching. Okay. All the way up through the system in every area. And that's why they're scattered throughout the entire land. Okay. It has been estimated, not by me, I didn't come up with this, but it's been estimated that every Jew in the land that they inhabited was no further than 10 miles from a Levirate city. Okay. So you could go in, and I mean, you know, it's, you stop and think about how, and if you go back through chapter 21, you see how they're spread out population-wise and scattered throughout the geography, and you say, well, if I lived here, well, okay, boom, there's Bethel. If I lived down here, boom, if I lived over here, boom. You know, 8 miles here, 6 miles there. You got to realize that this isn't a huge, this is not like the United States, okay? You know, this is a limited geographical area that we have here. Okay? You're only talking about something that's, you know, I mean, this here is only 65 miles or so. Okay? If you include Galilee and you include here, you're still only looking like 110, 115 miles north to south. And in places, you know, you're only looking at 25 miles wide up to maybe 40 or 45 miles wide. There's not a huge amount of square acreage out there. And you've got 48 cities that are more or less evenly dispersed throughout the town. So God set it up so that there would be adequate availability for the Levites to be available to teach as people came. Okay, that's the whole what is being implied here. So you get to verse 43. And it says, the Lord gave to Israel all the land which he swore to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. Now, there's a glitch here. You have to kind of understand the context. Okay? This is what he gave to the fathers. This is not the same, I don't believe, though some see it differently, they're wrong, that this is not the fulfillment, of the ultimate possession of the land that will not be completed until the Messianic kingdom, okay, following the second coming of Christ. That's when you actually see the full possession of the land take place. Okay? Certainly they don't have it today by any means, but you kind of get the idea that's there. Verse 44, more on this in a moment. And the Lord gave them rest round about. Well, he did give them rest, but you see what is being said here. It's comparative, or it's relative. You have generic statements, kind of proverbial statements. He gave them all the land that he swore to the fathers. Yeah, but that's not the Abrahamic covenant, because it's simply not the same breadth and scope of the land. You go back to Genesis 15 and you start talking about from the great river of Egypt, to the river Euphrates, and all of a sudden you realize that this outline designated land description in chapters 15 through 19 simply only makes up a portion of what the Abrahamic covenant described. Okay, so make sure that you don't, swap stuff back and forth. Make sure you deal with some of the descriptions wisely. And it's the same thing with the Lord gave Israel rest. He gave them, he gave them rest. Unless you're Caleb, who is fighting day and night against this city, and you've already seen that he promises his daughter to somebody who's going to go over and whip this bunch of guys. That's not rest. I always get it. Who was it? I don't know whether it was. Bill Malden, or I think it was Ernie Pyle in the Second World War in Stars and Stripes. He said, you read in the Stars and Stripes, you're laying there in a muddy foxhole after being pinned down for 48 hours, in 40-degree weather with snow on the ground, and the Stars and Stripes says there's relative quiet in your area, of France, and you think, wow. This is relatively, down, and here comes another artillery barrage. It compared to what? Okay? So, just keep in mind, this is a generic statement that's almost a proverbial type of thing that says there was rest in the land. Yeah, in the general overall, military sense, there was rest in the land. Now the tribes had been dispersed. They had gone to finish securing their portions, driving them out. You kind of get the idea, okay? All the way through that. So, the other thing too is just something that you can tuck away. When you read the Abrahamic covenant as it is restated in chapter 17, it says that once Israel possesses the land promised under the Abrahamic covenant, which I see as the same thing as the Messianic kingdom at the return of Christ, then Israel will never again not be in possession of the land. Okay? Can't be this, because they wind up getting kicked out. They wind up getting captured and dispersed. For almost 1900 years, there was no homeland for the Jews in the part of the world that we call Palestine politically. It simply didn't, but, the Abrahamic covenant said that once they take permanent, I'll add a word, permanent possession, never again. They will then be there forever from that point on. Well, politically, realistically, and practically, the Jews have been kicked and thumped and hammered and run here and run there and dispersed, captured, and so forth, for, well, time and, 2,800 years, since the time of the Babylonian captivity, that's at the minimum. So you kind of get the idea as well. All right, then we move. It says, their fail. Verse 45 said that, it talks about delivering their enemies into their hand. Within the realm of the context of the book of Joshua, that's true. But that doesn't include, I don't see, because the description of the land possessed then is not the same as that which is promised under the Abrahamic covenant. So, verse 45, fail not any of the good things that the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel that came to pass. Well, yeah, you can count on God's word. Okay? Absolutely the promises. Okay? The second part that we look at, and many study Bibles are going to have a major break between chapters 21 and 22. They're going to make some kind of a notation that now the land is all settled, now the land is all divided, the Levite, everything has been apportioned by tribes and clans and peoples, and then they're going to say, and these are the closing chapters. I kind of think that chapter 22 doesn't fit there. I think chapter 22 goes better with chapter 21 than, and I'll kind of explain to you why. Because you have here a potential civil war that is described. You get an entire chapter of what is being described as a dispute, a border dispute. Okay, we'll kind of read about it and you kind of get the idea. Joshua called the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh, right? These are guys Cisjordan, okay? The 2.5 tribes, okay? Gadites, Reubenites, and then Manasseh was half and half scattered kind of this way up under here. So he calls them together and he basically says, you guys fulfilled your duty. He's pinning on medals. I mean, he's got a whole bucket full of medals. He's got the guys lined up. He's pinning on valorous service, meritorious achievement, a gold star for you, a lollipop there. He's got everything covered. He's patting them on the back in every way he can. These guys, for almost 8 years, they have left hearth and home and families, and whether you want to think it's a rotational basis or whatever, but a good portion of their 20 to 60-year-olds have left this relatively secure area and been involved in these military campaigns, for year after year after year. Now, probably, I'm suspecting that probably at least some of these guys, after a couple of years, rotated home. Can't prove it. Okay, and were replaced by the next batch because that would seem more equitable for everybody concerned, but that might not be the case. Maybe these guys spent the whole 7 to 8 years, on one tour of duty, in the Mideast. Figure that. Never mind, we won't go there. Okay, so he calls them there and commends them because this was they fulfilled what they had agreed to under Moses before Joshua ever took charge and took them across the Jordan. They had agreed to this situation where some of their men would stay home and the rest of them would help the other 9.5 tribes conquer the land in these major military maneuvers and confrontations. He says, you have not, verse 3, have not left your brethren these many days unto this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. This was the agreement before God that they would do. Okay? And now he says, okay, the military campaigns are over, the land has been divided, the 9.5 tribes are all heading out in their various directions to continue to secure the land and drive out the remainder. of the Canaanite inhabitants. So you guys can go home. Congratulations, terrific, you can go home. And here's a brownie, it's, head on your way, you got the idea. Okay? But there is a charge, isn't there? There is a charge here. Verse 5, somebody read that nice and loud for us. Verse 5 of chapter 22.
But take diligent heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses the servant of the Lord charged you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cleave unto him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul.
Okay, so Joshua blessed them, sent them away, and they headed to their tents, packed everything up, which included 7.5 years worth of loot. These men went back rich and went back to share, because they were representatives of their 2.5 tribes. It just wasn't their personal loot. Okay, it was for the good of the whole. Okay? More of a communal type of thing. But they had those that lived through it and everything that went with it. They were going back wealthy. They were going back honored. They were going back to places of prestige. It's great. Under God actually gives them this charge, but it comes through under Joshua of what's contained in verse 5. Okay. Now here's the problem that you get. Verse 7 says, to the 1/2 of the tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given this possession and that and there, and he spoke to him in return. Verse 8, with much riches to your tents, very much cattle, silver, gold, brass, iron, all kinds of clothing, and divide the spoil of your enemies with your brethren. Okay? Because there's a principle here. He who stays home is part of the army as much as he who goes and fights on the front line. Okay? It's not just the soldier that goes to fight, it's the wife and the mother and the family that stay home and keep the nation from falling apart, while those that go to fight, go to fight. Okay? It's sometimes we get that skewed a little bit, and we think, well, Audie Murphy was fantastic, but the guy who stayed home and made the cartridges for Audie's guns, he was a nobody, and we don't have to pay attention to him. Or kept food on the table for Audie Murphy's parents while Audie was. I'm not taking away from Mr. Murphy. Okay, he certainly was a hero. And sadly enough, he came back very messed up mentally and emotionally, and it didn't go well for him for years, but you get the idea. So those that stay home are equally part of the effort, aren't they? And sometimes we think, well, they're not really that important. Yeah, well, I don't think so. Okay. So they came back to divide it. The children of Reuben and the children of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh returned, and they departed from the children of Israel out of Shiloh. Okay, they came back down to here. They get back to Shiloh. They're not actually just a little bit north of where they crossed the river, and may have gone right back in the same general area of where they came into the land 7.5 years before. Okay. And they've got all these possessions. They're driving cattle herds. They're driving thousands of sheep, whatever it happens to be. Everything that goes through there. Verse 10 says, when they came to the borders of the Jordan, it's just, if you look at it from the ground view, you've got a mountainous area that runs all the way down here, and then you've got a mountainous area that runs down through here. The Jordan Valley is actually a cleft, okay, between these two mountain systems. It's 5 to 15 miles wide, and it is a natural geographical marker, a division point from east side of the Jordan to the west side. It's a boundary that is very notable and very distinct. So when they get to the Jordan, there's this situation that comes up. The children of the, verse 10 in the middle there, the children of the, built there an altar by the Jordan, a great altar to see to. Okay? So they erect this altar. You remember when the gang came across, they had this whole, priest's feet heat the thing, and then they went out and put rocks in the ground, in the water, and all that stuff. It was pretty neat, as a remembrance thing. These guys come back and they build an altar. Now, things can be misunderstood. Here's one of the lessons we get from this little incident that's here. This little altar almost becomes the turning point of a civil war between the 2.5 tribes and the rest of them. Because things get blown out of proportion. All of us realize that the media is always totally honest and totally accurate when it comes to presenting the whole picture so that there aren't any misunderstandings. I don't know what they used for Facebook, email, and Twitter back in those days, but the word got out that these 2.5 tribes had built an altar, and things all just blew up, right? So you have the picture that's here. Somebody pick up with verse 11 and read down through verse 14 for us.
And the children of Israel heard say, Behold, the children of Reuben and the children of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built an altar over against the land of Canaan, in the borders of Jordan at the passage of the children of Israel. And when the children of Israel heard of it, the whole congregation of the children of Israel gathered themselves together at Shiloh to go up to war against them. And the children of Israel sent unto the children of Reuben and to the children of Gad and to the half-tribe of Manasseh into the land of Gilead, Phinehas the son of Eleazar the priest, and with him 10 princes of each chief house, 10 princes of each chief house, a prince throughout all the tribes of Israel. And each one was the head of the house of their fathers among the thousands of Israel.
Okay, so you've got the initial response. You got these people getting ready to head out, the 9.5 tribes. Word gets to them that the 2.5 tribes, the warriors, with a bunch of loot, have built an altar. The problem with that, you see, is back in verse 5. Okay? This was the charge given, okay? And put yourself in the listener's booth for just a moment. Put your earphones on. And they are charged here to love the Lord God, walk in his ways, keep his commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not erect any graven image. Thou wilt make no sacrifices by it. Okay? You just go back to the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. Okay? What is perceived by these people that are still in Shiloh, that is, these guys have run clear off the rails. We're not sure what the situation is, but we're not going to put up with this, and they go after it. They gather for war. They're not going to compromise. They're just not going to tolerate this type of what they initially perceive as walking away from God. Okay? We're not going to allow that. Okay? More on that in a moment. We'll take a look at another aspect of it. But somewhere, cooler heads prevailed and said, rather than leading the discussion by nuking them with F-15s, if you don't get that reference, you're a little slow, then what we'll do is we'll send a delegation headed up by Phinehas. And while we're gathering the army, because we may need to go after these guys in force, we'll send Phinehas out there, and he can kind of slide in and ask, hey guys, listen, what's going on here? What's with this altar thing? Okay? And that's exactly what you see occur in the following verses. Verse 15 says, they came to the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, the half-tribe, we got all that. And they spoke with them, saying, this is how the whole congregation, what trespass is this that you have committed against the God of Israel? to turn away from following the Lord, that you have built an altar and you might rebel this day against the Lord. This is what's perceived. Okay? Scuttlebutt, innuendo, implication, rumor, murmurings, false information, partial information, half-truths. You know, maybe somebody was out to get Gad or Reuben. I mean, I don't know. They didn't like them because the brother-in-law had sold, you know, a sheep that smelled bad. I don't know why they do that. All sheep smell bad, you know. But anyway, you get the idea. He said, verse 17, is the iniquity of Peor too little for us, from which we are not cleansed until this day? Although there was a plague in the congregation of the Lord, that you must turn away this day from following the Lord. He used a historical event that had been a plague in Israel to say, what's going on here about the seriousness of this? Don't you understand how idolatrous worship can, you know, the destruction can run rampant through the whole place? You must turn away this day. He said, are you going to turn away this day from, it's in a question mark. And it will be, seeing you rebel today against the Lord, that tomorrow he will be wroth, and the whole congregation of Israel is going to get hammered. So we're not messing with this. If you're going to go this altar routine, we're going to smoke you. That's all there is to it, you know. Full speed ahead, arm the torpedoes, you know, go after it, okay? Notwithstanding, and he goes on. Now, here's a classic thing. This is Phineas. Okay? Guy's a pretty good statesman. He says, now, if the real problem is that you don't like the way the land is dispersed, I'm just going to paraphrase it for you. Okay? If the land of your possession is unclean, if it's not working out for you, if it's not as prosperous, if it's not as tillable, you know, if there's too much idolatrous stuff that you're having to deal with in the 2.5 tribes allocation of the land over here, he says, is that the problem? He said, let's sit down at the table. Maybe we can recast the lots or come up with it, and maybe we can move some of your people over into this side of the Jordan. You know, is there an option besides going to war? Let's work on something that can, you know, let's be diplomatic and work some of this stuff out so that we can come to an agreeable conclusion that, you know, is that the problem? Is that why you're doing this, what they perceive as an idolatrous structure, building this altar there when crossing the Jordan? So that's the trespass that he's talking about. He even mentions in verse 20, he says, did not Achan the son of Zerah commit a trespass with the accursed thing? And he said, wrath fell on the whole congregation of Israel. He said, you know, we're not going to allow that to happen. And your guys, if indeed you are trespassing against God, we're going to be the vehicle of God's judgment. We're not going to wait, because if we just dawdle around and do nothing and pretend it's not happening, God's going to cause us problems as well. He's going to chasten the entire nation because of your disobedience and rebellion. See, that's the picture that's going on. Now, the children of the 2.5 tribes, here we go again, okay, answered and said to the rest of the heads of all of the other people in Israel, verse 22, he says, the Lord God, he knows, and Israel shall know, if it is rebellion or transgression. He says, don't even bother, God, this is almost a prayer, God, don't even bother saving us this day. Go ahead. If we are guilty of transgression, just clean us off the face of the earth right now. Okay? Wow, that's a pretty bold statement. You got to pretty much have a clean heart and a clear conscience to make that kind of a statement. It's kind of like Jesus saying, he is without sin, let him cast the first stone. You know, that's a pretty demanding statement that says if we're guilty, then the Lord should just wipe us right out, right here on the spot. So he says in verse 23, we have built an altar. He said, if that is the case, that we've built an altar for the purpose of turning from following the Lord, or to offer thereon burnt offering or meat offering. That was forbidden. That could only be done by the Levitical priesthood, okay, in the temple when you come to the sacrifices and so forth. He said, let the Lord require, he said, there's certain things you can't do under the system. They're already laid out under the law. Now verse 24, if we have not rather done it for fear of this saying, in the time to come. Now, in essence, he's saying, here's the purpose for the altar. It wasn't for sacrifice. Okay? It wasn't for worship. It wasn't for feast days. It wasn't for cleansing of sin. Okay? Here's the purpose that you get to as you go through verse 24. In time, the times to come, children will come who will speak to our children, saying, what have you to do with the Lord God of Israel? For the Lord hath made Jordan a border between us. And he said, it could be a problem. You've got 2.5 tribes that live over here. There are months of the year, if you're limited to foot traffic, that you can't get across the Jordan River Valley. Okay? There are floods. There are all kinds of difficulties with the crossings. You can't get through there during the rainy times of the year. You can't get through there in biblical times in the winter time, okay, and so forth. The river rises and falls. It's not quite the same today, obviously, and we have, modern conveniences and everything to do with it. He's talking about they are looking down the road and saying, you're going to have 2.5 tribes over here, and they're going to get to the point of being strangers with the other 9.5 tribes, because the Jordan River is a separating border between us. They said, we don't want that. Okay? We are part of Israel. We are part of the nation. We don't want to be separate from the nation. We want to be part of. So they have a concern for the kids and the grandkids and the great-grandkids are going to grow up never having been on the west side of the Jordan River. Okay? They're not going to relate. They're going to think, well, we've got distant cousins 4 times removed on your mother's side, but if, so we talk about shirt-tail relatives, they're going to be able to pass on to the grandkids and great-grandkids that they have a vague family tree that also includes a bunch of Jewish-type people that live way over there on the other side of the Jordan. Because in that day and age, unless you were literally running in front of a conquering army, most people born, raised, worked their whole lives and died within 10 or 12 miles. Okay? That was their land. And now that they have land given to them by the Lord, and it's broken up into families and clans and everything else, this is their possession. This is their roots. Okay? It's not like trench in America where we just up and go because of jobs or family or illnesses or opportunities or whatever. They don't do that. Nope, not there. Not in this period of Israel's history, not at all. It also overflows to today. So, you see what's going on here. The Lord hath made Jordan a border between us, between you and us, between the 2.5 tribes. And he says, we don't want that. He says, so verse 26 says, therefore we said, let us now prepare to build us an altar, not for burnt offerings, not for sacrifice, but to be a witness. So that we can bring our kids down here, and we can point to that altar and say, we are one with the people on the other side of the Jordan. We are not a separate people. We fought with them. We fought for them. They fought with us. They fought with us. We conquered the whole land because of the Lord leading. We want our kids, grandkids, great-grandkids to use this altar as a reminder, not to sacrifice on, not to worship on, okay? Not to try to violate the Mosaic law, but as a point of remembrance. Most of us have family photo albums, okay? That's kind of what you're talking about in parallel. Okay? Who's this old guy here? That was your great-great-grandfather. He fought in the Civil War. And then all your family history, it ties everything together, okay? Not just the genealogy, but who did what and where and what they were involved in and what kind of people they were. Every time the children of those 2.5 tribes came down and saw that altar, it opened up the dialogue that refreshed the fact that they were part of Israel. They were part of a greater whole. They weren't just part of 2.5 tribes. They were part of all 12. Get the picture that's there? The witness that is there. He uses the same terminology in verse 28. It is not for burnt offerings or sacrifice, but a witness. God forbid that we should rebel against the Lord. We are not building it for burnt offerings, for meat offerings, sacrifices. He said that's up to the tabernacle. He said that's not it. Okay. Now Phineas, he listens to this and says, "Cool." And he says, shake, brother, no problem. And he heads back. He's covered. He's perfect. The whole situation is cleared up, and he takes the word back. It tells us to Eleazar, who was the priest, and all the leaders of Israel. And he goes back apparently to Shiloh. The word gets out. The army goes, don't have to go kill our cousins, at the border. This is great. Happy ending. Okay, happy ending. Okay, great. Okay. The verse 34 down there, the last verse. The children of Reuben and the children of Gad, and I'm assuming the half that, anyway, it called the altar Ed. That's not short for Edward. Okay. It literally means witness in the Hebrew. I didn't make it up. And it says it will be a witness between us that the Lord is God. Is the Lord of resolve. Now, in closing, here's some principles that maybe you've figured out some of them. I've mentioned some of them. Okay. Number one is that the 9.5 tribes are to be commended. They are. They're to be commended because they will not tolerate idolatry within the nation. They won't back away from biblical truth. This is right, and that is not. We're not going to back away from it. Okay? We're going to address the issue. We're not just going to go, oh, well, some people got different points of view. It's not going to happen. Okay? Now, the situation isn't exactly parallel for us, so don't get too carried away. But there's no compromise when it comes to spiritual truth. God said, that settles it. Okay, now what do we do? And that's, of course, number 2. He did, don't judge strictly on circumstantial evidence. Okay? Don't let your mouth get you into trouble when you read something on Twitter or Facebook. Okay? Okay? The internet, okay, is not always true, regardless of Abraham Lincoln posting on his site that you can believe everything that's there, because after all, never mind. Don't jump into action on a wham bam knee-jerk reaction based upon circumstantial evidence. Get you into all kinds of trouble. Okay? Number 3, open discussion can clear up all kinds of misunderstandings. Don't we wish this was true in our own country and our political scenes and so forth, where you could actually sit down and have open discussions instead of coming with your own concrete agendas and throwing rocks at the person on the other side of the aisle? Yeah. Stop and think about it. Open discussion. You hear something. What did Jesus teach about that? You have aught against your brother? Go talk to him. You don't fire up the N-15, the F-15 and the nukes. You just don't do that. You go and you say, hey, I heard so and so, and I was wondering. Explain that to me. Talk to me a little bit. What's your take on that situation? What was actually said, not said. What was meant, regardless of what was said. You get the idea. Fourth thing, and especially for the accused, Solomon put it well several hundred years later in Proverbs 15, verse 11. I think it was Solomon. A gentle answer turns away wrath. You can still be diplomatic even though you disagree with the complete nitwit that's on the other side of the fence. Or you can pour gas on the flames and then complain because your marshmallow got singed. Come on. There is a time for tact and diplomacy. There might also be a time, as Solomon said, in everything there is a time and everything a season where you might have to punch the guy in the nose. Okay, but that usually has all kinds of ripple effects that you may not like. Okay, and maybe this phrase matters graciously. Maybe it ties in with one or more of the previous ones. In other words, Phineas left some options open. He said, if there's something troubling you that we don't know about that's causing you to act in what seemingly is a contrary to God way, let's talk through this. Maybe we can come up with an agreeable option that will work. Maybe we can relocate some of your guys over here or over there if there's troubling thing to the geography or whatever's going on. Okay? So leave your options open. If you make a habit of burning bridges, you better hope you never have to retreat. Okay? Because you have got some real problems. Now, for what it's worth, people ask this once in a while. You got 2.5 tribes that settled here. I think I mentioned this earlier, and then you got another 7 or 8 years before these guys begin to settle. One of the reasons for the Levitical cities was to provide a spiritual border. Okay, you're not have to worry about too much this way. Down here, there's nothing but a few camels. Okay, but you've got all kinds of Canaanite peoples that are going to harass Israel in the future that come this way and this way. Okay, these cities that provided instruction in the law through the Levites, through the priesthood primarily, okay, were a kind of a spiritual buffer. If the nation's having problems, go to the law, go to the people that can give you good instruction and good counsel. If spiritually there's idolatrous things that are creeping in, they've got this 48 city ring that permeates throughout the nation that they can go to. Okay? Theoretically, that's kind of what we're supposed to have for the bride of Christ, the churches throughout our land and throughout our world today. But sometimes it works a little bit and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's the church's fault and sometimes it's just people don't want to hear what the churches have to say. That's it. Questions or thoughts? Yes, Sue.
I